It was one of those days when the house seemed unreal. Sunlight filled the living room, hitting the hardwood floors and creating long, golden lines. The quiet sound of the air conditioner was the only sound I heard as I folded laundry on the couch. My fingers moved by themselves, following the rhythm of the task, so much so that I barely thought about it. But my mind was far from calm. It was one of those days when the home seemed more than real. Sunlight illuminated the living room, casting elongated golden rays on the hardwood floors. The air conditioner was on, and I could hear its hum. I was folding laundry on the couch, my fingers moving by themselves, the rhythm of the task so familiar that it required minimal thought. However, my mind was far from tranquil. I could not recall the last time Greg had kissed me. It was not a peck on the cheek or a hurried goodbye on the way to work, but a genuine kiss that made my heart flutter, leaving me breathless and yearning for more. Years had passed, but the pain of its loss remained as vivid as ever. My spouse had become a stranger inside our house, engulfed by incessant meetings, emails, and the illumination. I couldn't remember the last time Greg had kissed me. It wasn't just a quick peck on the cheek or a quick goodbye on the way to work. It was a real kiss that made my heart flutter, leaving me breathless and wanting more. Years had passed, but I still felt the pain of his absence as strongly as ever. My spouse had become a stranger in our house, always busy with meetings, emails, and his phone. Even though he wasn't physically there, his absence felt very real. I saw my reflection in the window, and the late afternoon sun made the lines around my eyes look more noticeable. I was 33, not old, but I wasn't the carefree girl I used to be. Instinctively, I adjusted the strap of my camisole, the lace touching my skin. The fabric felt comfortable against my body. It felt both comforting and sexy. I thought about when someone last really noticed me, and then there was Nathan. He had been with us for a few months. He had graduated from college and returned to save money while looking for a job. At 22, he was the complete opposite of Greg. He was full of energy and self-confidence. He was confident, and his presence highlighted the differences between my husband and me. I saw how his laughter echoed throughout the home, and how his eyes lit up as he spoke about his future goals. Despite my attempts to dismiss the idea, I saw how his t-shirt fit him. His presence had first shown the gap between my husband and me, but now it had changed. I saw how his laughter echoed through the house and how his eyes lit up as he spoke about his future goals. Despite my efforts to ignore the idea, I saw how his t-shirt stuck to his chest and how his scent lingered in the air after he left. It was wrong to think about him that way, but I knew it. Still, the heart doesn't follow the rules of morality. The sound of footsteps interrupted my thoughts. Nathan was looking through the kitchen, from the refrigerator. I noticed his shirt was on his chest, and his scent was still in the air. It was wrong to think that way about him. I knew this, but hearts don't follow the rules of morality. The sound of footsteps interrupted my thoughts. Nathan was looking through the kitchen. I could tell by the clinking of glass bottles and the soft shuffling of his bare feet on the grass. The house now seemed warmer, and the air felt thicker, as if his presence could change the feeling of the place. "Nathan!" I yelled, my voice steady, hiding the fight inside me. He came into the doorway a few moments later. His tall figure was lit up by the kitchen light. He was wearing a plain t-shirt. The clinking of glass bottles and the gentle shuffling of his bare feet on the grass made the house seem warmer. The air felt thicker, as if his presence could change the feeling of the room. "Nathan!" I yelled, my voice steady, hiding the fight inside. Mahay appeared in the doorway a moment later. His tall figure was lit up by the kitchen light. He was wearing a plain t-shirt, sweatpants, and his hair was a bit messy, like he had just woken up. "Can you help me with something?" he asked, entering the room easily. His relaxed confidence made me more attracted to him. I looked away from him, my fingers awkwardly holding the clasp of my bra under my clothes as the strap kept sliding. "I asked you to adjust." My voice, which had become very quiet. A moment of silence passed, like the last note of a melody was about to disappear, and then I saw him coming closer. I stopped breathing when he touched my shoulders. His fingers gently touched the thin strap of my shoulder bag as he adjusted it. His touch was strong but careful, like he was being careful. This made me shake with excitement. "Is this okay?" he asked quietly. I almost didn't hear him. "Yes," I said, barely able to speak. The room felt very small, and it felt like he was getting closer and closer. His fingers stayed on my shoulder for a long time, and I felt his breath on my neck. It was exciting. Something so simple could make me feel many things. He stepped back. I turned to face him. My hands automatically adjusted the strap, even though it wasn't enough. Our eyes met. For the first time, I saw my own emotions in his gaze. I saw tension and a question, but neither of us said it. "Thank you," I said, but my tone was different from usual. "No problem," he said. He answered, speaking quietly. He didn't move, but his eyes looked at my neck for a moment before looking back at me. The moment felt full of feelings we couldn't express. Suddenly, like the universe trying to ruin the magic, his phone vibrated in his pocket. The noise woke us up. He quickly took out his phone and said he had to answer a call. He left the room, but I stayed. He replied in a quieter voice, but he didn't move. He stood in the bedroom in front of the mirror, trying to adjust the strap of his favorite blouse. His eyes looked at the neckline of my chamiso for a moment, then back to mine. The moment felt full of hidden feelings, and neither of us said anything. Suddenly, as if the world wanted to ruin the magic, his phone vibrated in his pocket. The noise made us stop and focus on reality. He quickly took it out and said he needed to answer a call. He left the room, and I stayed there for a long time. My pulse was fast, and my mind was thinking about every moment of what had just happened. It seemed like it was going to happen, but the tingling feeling on my skin from his touch and the strange energy moving through my body showed that it wasn't. Later that night, I was lying in bed by myself, thinking about his touch. I closed my eyes, trying to stop the thoughts from coming, but I couldn't. Under all the guilt and confusion, a question started to appear. I was there for a long time, my pulse racing, and my thoughts replaying every moment of what had just happened. It seemed harmless, but the tingling feeling on my skin from his touch and the strange energy flowing through my body showed otherwise. Later that evening, as I lay in bed alone, I couldn't stop thinking about his touch. I closed my eyes, trying to get rid of these thoughts, but I couldn't. And beneath the layers of guilt and uncertainty, a question began to form in my mind. If something so small could have such a big impact, what would happen if we stopped denying its existence? The house, usually calm, felt full of potential. Each moment was filled with anticipation for what might happen next. That afternoon, the house was especially quiet. It was the kind of quiet that made every sound from the floorboards and the refrigerator in the next room seem louder. I stood in my bedroom before the mirror, trying to adjust the strap of my black bra. One small thing can have a huge impact. If something so small could have such an effect, what would happen if we admitted it was there? The house, usually calm, felt full of potential. We were expecting something that afternoon, and the house was especially quiet. Every noise, like the sound of the floorboards or the refrigerator, seemed to echo. I stood in the bedroom before the mirror, trying to adjust the strap of my black bra. It had always been a bit loose, like a lot of things in my life. But today, the strap was especially stubborn. I pulled at it, turning my arm uncomfortably behind my back, but the clasp wouldn't budge. My mirror looked back at me, as if it was challenging me. I didn't often do this. Greg was away, but I didn't usually ask for help. It had almost become a habit, but today was different. The strap on my shirt had always been a bit loose, like a lot of things in my life. Today, though, it felt especially stubborn. I pulled at it, moving my arm around behind my back, but the clasp wouldn't budge. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a clear challenge in my eyes, as if it was telling me to ask for help. I didn't usually ask for help. Greg wasn't here, and asking for help had become a habit I barely remembered. But today was different. I felt a weight on my heart, like a big dark shadow covering the light. Then, I heard Nathan's footsteps coming closer. It was the sound of his sneakers on the carpet. I called out to him, and he stopped for a second, then came to me. He didn't seem bothered or cold, but he looked a bit surprised. I asked him for a favor. He came in the door, leaning against it with one hand on his big shoulders. He was wearing a t-shirt. The loneliness felt heavier than ever, like a dark cloud covering the light. Then, I heard Nathan's footsteps on the carpet. I called out to him, and he stopped for a moment before coming closer. He seemed relaxed and not bothered, but there was a warmth in his eyes that I hadn't noticed before. I asked him for a favor. He came into the room, leaning against the doorframe with one hand on his big shoulders. His t-shirt looked like it was on purpose, even though I knew it wasn't. Nathan was just calm, sure of himself, and focused on what was happening. He looked at me, his eyebrows slightly raised, as our eyes met. I paused for a second, feeling the words stuck in my throat, but I kept going, speaking in a light and casual way. I pointed to my shoulder, where the strap was hurting me. Shirt stuck to him, even though I knew it wasn't on purpose. Nathan was just calm, confident, and interested in what was happening. He looked a little confused when we looked at each other. I stopped for a second, but I kept going with a light and casual tone. I pointed to my shoulder, where the strap was bothering me. We were both pretty frustrated, and we were connected by an invisible thread. His expression changed a little, his eyebrows went up in surprise, and then he looked even more confused. "Yeah, sure," he said. Going into the room, I turned my back to him, really aware of everything: the afternoon light, the little bit of his cologne smell, the sound of his breathing, steady but a little. We were still working out the details of our request, and it was frustrating. We were connected by an invisible thread. His expression changed a little, and his eyebrows went up in surprise. Then his expression became more mysterious. "Sure," he replied, entering the room. I turned my back to him, aware of everything: the afternoon light, the faint scent of his cologne, his breathing, which was steady but a little heavier than before. My skin tingled as his hand touched my shoulder. His fingers were tentative at first, then more sure as he opened the clasp. "Is this acceptable?" he asked, his voice now low. "Yes," I said, barely audible. The atmosphere was thick with an unknown energy. His fingers were warm, his touch kind and strong, as if he were about to do something. He was heavier than before, and my skin tingled as his hand touched my shoulder. At first, his fingers were tentative, but then they became more sure as he opened and closed the clasp. "Is this acceptable?" he asked, his voice low and quiet. "Yes," I said, barely audible. The air felt thick, with a strange energy. His fingers were warm, and his touch was kind but strong, like he was about to do something important. For a moment, I closed my eyes, and let this feeling fill me up. It was a simple touch, but it felt like a lifeline. After a pause, he moved back a little. "That's enough," I said, turning to face him. My hand automatically went to adjust the strap, even though it wasn't needed. Our eyes met, and for a second, everything else in the room disappeared. The light, the soft sounds. Something fragile. I closed my eyes for a moment, enjoying the feeling. "A touch, but like a lifeline," he said after a pause. "That's enough." I turned to face him. My hand moved by itself to adjust the strap, even though it wasn't needed. Our eyes met, and for a second, everything else in the room disappeared. The quiet hum of the house was ignored by the strength of his stare. It seemed to go through the barriers I had built around myself. "Thank you," I said, my voice more calm than expected. He agreed, but didn't move. He stayed still, his hands at his sides, looking at the strap for a second before looking back at me. The sounds of the house were ignored because of how intense his stare was. It seemed like he was looking right through the barriers I had built around myself. "Thank you," I said, sounding more calm than I expected. He agreed, but didn't move. He stood still with his hands at his sides, looking at the strap on my bra for a moment, then back at me. He felt nervous because he was holding his phone in his pocket. It was vibrating and making the atmosphere uncomfortable. He searched for it, saying sorry while looking at the screen. "I'll take this," he said, moving towards the door, but even after he left, his eyes stayed on me for a moment, as if he didn't want to leave. After he left, the room felt even more empty than before. The silence got louder. I sat on the side of the bed, my fingers with tension until his phone vibrated in his pocket, shattering the atmosphere. He fumbled for it, muttering an apology while glancing at the screen. "I'll take this," he stated, retreating toward the door. Yet even as he departed, his gaze lingered, as if reluctant to leave. Once he was gone, the room felt more desolate than before. The silence intensified. I sat on the edge of the bed, my fingers grazing the strap of my bra, which was now perfectly positioned. But my thoughts were not on the strap. Instead, I recalled the sensation of his hands against my skin and the way his eyes regarded me. Not merely as his stepmother, but as a woman. The thought persisted, unwelcome yet inescapable. It was not just about Nathan. It pertained to my own self, namely the aspect that had been deprived of attention, physical contact, and I was thinking about how I felt when he touched me. Felt like I was finally being noticed. I felt like I was finally being appreciated. I remembered everything that happened that night. I remembered every little detail. His fingers were nervous at first, but then they got used to it. His voice was quiet when he asked if it was okay. His eyes looked like he was feeling something, but I'm not sure what. I didn't want to. I felt a closeness that made me feel alive for the first time in years. I felt understood that night as I lay in bed. I thought about the moment again and again, and every detail was as clear as if it were happening right then. His fingers stopped, then became confident. His voice became softer when he asked if it was okay, and his eyes looked at me with a feeling I couldn't put my finger on. I knew I should feel sorry. I knew I should stop thinking about it. But I didn't. I let myself feel these feelings, and they made me feel alive. I let myself feel them, even though I didn't want to. I let myself feel them, and they made me feel good. And as I closed my eyes, I thought about whether something so simple could make me feel such. I knew I should feel sorry, but I couldn't stop thinking about Nathan. I understood I should forget about these thoughts, but I couldn't. I let myself feel them, and I let them control me. I let myself think about how something so simple could make me feel so much. What other information is available? Maybe something else is hiding inside me, waiting to come out. I didn't want to think about it, but I was also excited to find out the truth. The days after that moment felt like they would never end, and they made me want to face things I was scared to admit to myself. I tried to distract myself. I was curious about my feelings, and I wondered what other information might be hidden deep within me. It was as if a part of me was waiting to share everything. I didn't want to deal with this feeling, but I also wanted to know the truth. The days after that moment felt like they would never end. It felt like time was stretching out, and I had to face things I didn't even want to think about. I tried to busy myself with household chores, like folding laundry, cleaning countertops, and watering the plants on the back porch. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about Nathan's touch. It was like a faint trace of perfume, but I couldn't ignore it. Every part of the house reminded me of him. I could smell his cologne in the hallway, and I could hear the echo of his voice. I was doing the usual household chores, like folding laundry, cleaning countertops, and watering the plants on the back porch. But I couldn't stop thinking about Nathan. His touch felt like a faint trace of perfume, but I couldn't ignore it. Every part of the house felt like he was there, like the smell of his cologne in the hallway, the sound of his laughter from the living room, and the way his coffee mug always ended up in the sink. Even though I kept telling him to put it in the dishwasher, every little thing felt bigger because of the tension between us. In the late afternoon, the sunlight streaming through the living room windows made golden streaks on the floor. I was sitting on the sofa with a book. I wasn't really reading, my eyes were on the text, but my thoughts were elsewhere. I could see him moving around in the kitchen. I heard the clinking of glasses and the faint sound of a podcast, but he wasn't paying much attention to it. He came into the room holding a glass of iced tea and stopped for a moment before entering fully. His presence filled the room instantly. I was sitting on the sofa with a book, but I wasn't reading. My eyes were looking at the book, but my thoughts were somewhere else. I could see him moving around in the kitchen. I could hear the clinking of glasses and the faint sound of a podcast, but he was only half listening. He came into the room with a glass of iced tea and stopped for a second before fully stepping inside. The atmosphere was comfortable, he said, with a slight smile. I looked down at my bare feet, covered by an oversized sweater. Comfortable was not the word I would have chosen. Maybe vulnerable or exposed would be better. It's a nice day for not doing anything, I said, trying to sound light and casual. It's a nice day to relax, he said, smiling slightly. My heart was beating fast, and I felt like I could barely breathe. He made a quiet, warm noise, and it made me feel something strong. Can I sit down? He asked, pointing to the end of the sofa. Of course, I said, but I sounded too excited and too quick. I moved a little to make room for him, and he sat down. He put his long legs on the sofa and touched me with his arms. My heart was beating rapidly. I felt a strong reaction to his soft chuckle. May I sit down? he asked, pointing to the other end of the sofa. Of course, I said, but my words were too fast and too excited. I moved a little to make room for him as he sat down. He put his long legs on top of mine. Our time together was short and unplanned, but it made me shake. I hoped he didn't notice. We stayed silent, and the only sound was the occasional rustling of pages as I pretended to read. The tension between us was clear but hard to describe. It grew stronger with each moment, and I felt him staring at me. His stare wasn't steady, but it lasted. It seemed like we met, but it was short and unplanned. I felt a shudder, and I wished he didn't notice. We stayed silent, and the only sound was the pages turning. I pretended to read, but I felt the tension between us. It got stronger every second, and I felt him staring at me. It seemed like he was trying to figure something out, but he wasn't ready to ask a question then. He spoke suddenly, his voice softer and a little nervous. "May I ask you something?" he said. I said yes, but I felt like I couldn't breathe. He paused, nervous, and ran a hand through his hair. "The last time we met, when I helped you with your strap, did that make you uncomfortable?" he asked. The question stayed in the air. He tried to figure something out, but he wasn't ready to ask. Then, he suddenly stopped and looked at C. His voice was softer now, almost scared. "Can I ask you something?" he said. I said yes, but I couldn't think of what to say. He paused, nervous, and rubbed his hair. "The day before, when I helped you with your strap, did that make you uncomfortable?" The question was hard to answer. I felt my cheeks get red as I tried to answer. "No," I said, but my voice was softer than I wanted it to be. It wasn't strange, but it was unexpected. He agreed, and looked at me. Surprisingly, he said the same thing again, as if he wanted to think about what it meant we didn't speak for a long time. I felt my cheeks flush with embarrassment as I tried to respond. "No," I eventually said, though my tone was softer than I had meant. It was not strange, but unexpected. He looked at me, and, surprisingly, repeated the phrase, as if trying to understand its meaning. We were separated by a large space, and neither of us spoke for a long time. The room felt very quiet, and the space between us felt both very big and very small. Then, as if compelled by an invisible force, he moved closer, his knee brushing against mine once more, this time on purpose. He spoke, barely above a whisper. He looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that I could not ignore. He looked weak and wanted something. The room felt very quiet, and I felt disconnected from him, but also attracted. Then, he moved closer to me, his knee touching mine. He spoke to me, barely above a whisper. He looked at me, and I saw that he looked weak and needed something. I looked at him, and I felt the same things he felt. I wanted to say something, but I couldn't. Instead, I grabbed the book on my lap, closed it and put it to the side. I stopped my hand right above the cushion between us, and I felt his warm calf on my fingers. He breathed slowly, and I understood that we were very close, and that the smallest movement could make us fall apart. I was surprised, but I didn't say anything. Instead, I grabbed the book from the cushion, opened it, and pretended to read the blurry words. I tried to say something, but I couldn't. I closed the book and put it to the side. My hand stopped just above the cushion, and I felt his warm calf on my fingers. He breathed slowly, and I realized that we were very close. I could feel my heart beating loudly, but he didn't move away. He came closer, looking at me. I felt like the moment would never end. It felt like time stopped, and I could feel the heat from him. I could feel the energy and the tension in the air. It felt like something magical was happening, and neither of us could control it. "Nathan," I said, my voice shaking a little, but I was still able to speak. I felt my pulse racing. Greg didn't pull away, though. He moved closer, looking at me. The moment felt long, as if time itself was paused, holding its breath. I felt the heat radiating from him. The energy and atmosphere around us made it clear that neither of them could control this. I said, "Nathan," my voice wavering but steady enough to disrupt the stillness. Before I could say more, the sound of the front door opening broke the moment. Greg's voice came from the hallway, cheerfully announcing his arrival. Nathan jumped back as if he had been scalded. He immediately changed his demeanor to seem neutral. I took the book from the cushion, opened it, and pretended to try to read the indistinct text. I was about to say something when the front door opened and Greg came in. He was smiling, and he said he was just going to the kitchen. He put his briefcase down and looked at me. I smiled and said, "What's going on?" I looked at him. Nathan didn't say anything. I could tell he was nervous because he was fidgeting with his hands on his thighs. Greg looked at me and kissed my forehead. He was distracted and didn't notice what was happening. He went to the kitchen, and we were alone for a long time. We didn't say anything about what almost happened. Nathan quickly left the room. I didn't move. I just stood there. I was gripped by the book, trying to catch my breath. My mind was a mess. I couldn't stop thinking about his eyes and touch, even though I knew what they meant. I was sure of one thing: this was just the start. What started as a calm moment had turned into something else. I was gripped by a sense of unease, my fingers clenching the book tightly as I struggled to catch my breath. My mind was a tumult of conflicting emotions. I couldn't forget the look on his face and the feel of his touch. I was certain of one thing: this wasn't over. What started as a calm moment had turned into something far more complex, and the future held both fear and excitement. That evening, the storm wasn't outside, but within. The house was filled with an eerie quiet, a sign of what was about to happen. Since the electricity had suddenly stopped working, we had left the house. The apartments were lit by dim lighting, and shadows moved around the walls. To my distress, their shapes changed with each little breeze. I had felt a storm inside me for days, maybe weeks, and today it seemed ready to break loose. I sat cross, the lights in the apartment were flickering. Shadows moved around the walls. They seemed to be watching me. I felt very upset. For some time, I had been feeling very angry and upset. Today, I felt it more than ever. I sat on the floor of the living room. I had a pack of playing cards in front of me. I was playing solitaire by candlelight. I wanted to stop feeling so upset. But it didn't work. My thoughts kept going to Nathan's hand. It had touched mine earlier that day. It was a short touch, but it made me feel warm. I was sitting on the floor of the living room, playing a card game called solitaire. I was trying to stop thinking about Nathan, but I couldn't stop. I remembered that he was in the kitchen, looking for a drink. I saw his shadow in the hallway. When he came back, I saw his shape. He had big shoulders, and he had 2 glasses of lemonade. The air was hot and wet, and he handed me a glass of lemonade without saying anything. Then he sat down on the floor next to me. I was surprised, because he was acting very tense, but I didn't say anything. I was too busy looking at the candle next to me. I felt his watchful presence, as tangible as the oppressive humidity enveloping my skin. "You're welcome," he said, his tone similarly muted. He reclined on his hands, extending his legs forward. The gesture was nonchalant and unpretentious, yet my gaze betrayed me fixated on the manner in which his tea. I felt like he was watching me, like he was right there, even though I couldn't see him. He was sitting there, relaxed, with his hands on his knees. He was wearing a t-shirt that was a little bit too tight, and I could see a little bit of skin above his waistband. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. I was too caught up in what I was seeing. I said to him, "Power outages always feel weird, don't they?" I said this because he was looking at me, and it felt like everything was different because we were the only ones talking. He agreed with me, and he told me that everything felt different because of the silence. I felt like there was something important about the silence, but I didn't know what it was. I looked away, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. "Power outages always feel strange," I said. "I agree," he said. "Everything feels different when there's no electricity." I shuffled the cards in my mind. "I'm going to play solitaire," he said. "I'll watch," I said. I smiled back at him, and he smiled back at me. I got closer to him, and I could tell that he was nervous. He smelled like a fresh, woody scent, and it made me want to shut my eyes and relax. The atmosphere between us seems to. The candles cast flickering shadows, and the atmosphere grew thicker with each moment. Nathan's voice grew quieter as he nervously played with a playing card, as if things weren't going to stay the same. I was surprised by the simplicity of the question. The candles were getting closer to the edge of the table. They were casting shadows that looked secretive. Nathan was nervous. He was playing with a playing card. He was asking a question. The question was simple, but it was serious. I understood that. I looked at him. His eyes did not move. I felt my heart beating faster. I could not answer him. I said that change is inevitable. I could barely be heard. I understood how important his question was. I looked at him, and he looked back at me. I was nervous, and I could barely speak. He nodded, and his eyes stayed on me. It felt like he was getting closer to me, and I could feel my heart beating faster. His hand moved closer to mine, but I didn't notice. He didn't seem to notice, but I could tell he was doing something. His hand moved closer to mine, and I felt my pulse quicken. It wasn't just a coincidence, though. CLA said something, but I didn't understand. I didn't say anything, because I didn't know what to say. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I felt scared and excited all at once. Then, he touched me. I couldn't look away. His voice was barely a whisper, but I understood what he meant. I want what I want, I thought, scared. I felt my skin shake. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. His fingers touched mine. I felt electric. I couldn't breathe. The lights flickered. His hand stayed still. His touch was soft, but I could tell he wanted me. His eyes looked into mine. I felt a surge of electricity run through me. I couldn't move. I felt like I couldn't breathe. The lights flickered, and the flames looked like they were moving. Nathan's hand was still in mine. His touch was gentle, but I could tell he wanted something from me. I couldn't look away. I couldn't move. I just sat there. I felt like this moment was happening to me. He told me it was okay. His voice was very quiet. It was almost a whisper. But I want what I want. I have a need that scared me. It made my skin shake. I couldn't look away. I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything except sit there and let the moment happen. He said it was okay. His voice was very quiet, almost like a whisper. But I want what I want. I have a need that scared me, and it made my skin shake and my heart beat faster. I didn't know what to say. I tried to show the many feelings I had. I did the only thing I could think of. I reached out my hand to him, and his fingers touched mine. He answered my silent question. The moment felt like it would never end. The air felt heavy with emotion. I didn't know what to say. I tried to do something, so I reached out my hand to him. Our fingers touched, and he held mine. We were both very nervous, and we waited for something to happen. Then, we heard a loud noise, like thunder, in the distance. It was raining outside, and it was still very windy. Nathan moved a little away from me, and he looked at me like he didn't understand what was happening. He said, "We should check the candles." Nathan's voice was calm, but his eyes showed that he was still worried. "Yes, we should check the candles," I said, my voice a little shaky but determined. He stood up and started to get the candles. I stayed sitting on the floor. My fingers were still tingling from his touch. I understood that whatever was going on, it was serious. I replied, my voice steady but strong, "Yes." He stood up and started to collect the candles. I stayed seated on the floor, my fingers still tingling from his touch. I understood that whatever this was and whatever it meant, it was not the end of the turmoil. It might have ended for now, but its effects were just beginning. The night was calm, but the effects of past events could not be undone. I understood that the real storm was still to come. The house was dimly lit, with only the faint glow of the TV screen casting changing patterns of light on the walls. The movie played on, its dialogue barely audible as background noise, but I couldn't recall the title or the plot. The film's significance lay not in its story, but in our shared experience. Nathan and I sat on opposite ends of the sofa, separated by a cushion. We felt close but also distant. I had a glass of wine on the coffee table, and the condensation made a ring around it. I felt the weight of his presence, the unspoken attraction that grew stronger with. Nathan and I sat on opposite ends of the sofa, separated by a cushion. We were close, but also far apart. I had a glass of wine on the coffee table, and the condensation made a ring around the base. I felt the weight of his presence, the unspoken attraction that grew stronger with each day. Greg was away, but his absence was always there. Today, it felt more overwhelming than ever. Nathan had been unusually quiet since dinner. His usual relaxed attitude was replaced by a seriousness that reflected my own. I secretly looked at him, watching the lines of his face. Every day, Greg was away, and I couldn't stop thinking about him. Today, it felt more overwhelming than ever. Nathan had been unusually quiet since dinner. He was not relaxed like usual, but he was also focused on something. I looked at him, and I could see that he was thinking hard. His jaw was sharp, and the light made it hard to see his lips. He was looking at the screen, but he wasn't paying attention. I said, "I can change the movie if you're not happy." My voice made him stop thinking. His jaw's angularity and the way the light flashed on his lips suggested he was preoccupied. He was looking at the screen, but his eyes were not focused. His voice seemed more composed than my feelings. He turned to me, his face softening. "Little negative, that is acceptable. I am only preoccupied with my inquiry, despite my uncertainty about my desire for the response." His stare remained fixed on mine for too long, causing my breath to falter once again. He seemed calmer than I felt. He turned to me, and his face looked less angry. I wanted to say something, but I couldn't find the words. Instead, I looked at Nathan. He looked at me, and his face looked less angry. I was worried about what I wanted to say, but I didn't know how to ask. He looked at me for a long time, and I started to breathe again. I felt tension, but I couldn't explain it. It was like we were connected, even though I didn't know why. He stopped for a moment, and then he said something. It wasn't important, but he looked like he was thinking hard about something else. I leaned back on the sofa, and I held my hands together. The blanket was on my lap, and the room felt too warm. The air felt strange, and my pulse was racing. I hated how noticeable it was, as if he could hear or feel it from where he was sitting. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the silence, but I couldn't find the words. Instead, Nathan, I wanted to say something to break the silence, but I couldn't find the words. Nathan moved closer, very quietly, which made my heart beat faster. I could feel the tension in the air, like static electricity. I felt like he was looking at me, checking me out. For the first time in a long time, I felt like he was really paying attention to me, not just as a wife or stepmother, but as a woman. He called my name quietly, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I looked at him, and my heart was beating very fast. He looked at me, but I couldn't tell what he was thinking. The movie continued, and I could barely hear it over the sound of my own breathing. He said my name quietly, and I felt a shiver. I looked at him, and my heart was beating fast. He looked at me, and I could tell he was confused. His eyes were looking at me, and I could tell he was trying to figure me out. The movie sound was quiet, and I could hear my heart beating. I asked him, very quietly, "What is it?" I was nervous. I didn't want to pressure him, so he spoke carefully. But I couldn't stop thinking about the fact that he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to finish it, but it was important. My heart was beating rapidly. I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, "What is it?" I didn't want to force him to feel uncomfortable. He spoke carefully, but I can't stop thinking about the fact that he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to finish it, but the meaning of what he said and didn't say hung heavily in the air between us. My mind was filled with a mix of thoughts and feelings that I couldn't understand. I knew I needed to stop, whatever it was, before things got worse. I found myself unable to talk or do anything, just sitting and waiting for what would happen next. "Nathan," I started to speak, but I could barely form words. "This doesn't define us. Should I not have been informed?" He suddenly interrupted me. We knew our feelings weren't right, but they still overwhelmed me. I felt exposed and vulnerable, but connected to something bigger. "Nathan," I started to speak, but I could barely form words. "This doesn't reflect who we are. Should I not have been informed?" He cut me off. We knew this was wrong, but it still shocked me. I felt exposed and vulnerable, but also connected to him. I wanted to go deeper into the experience. He looked at me, showing the same internal struggle. Fear, desire, guilt, and optimism all mixed together. I couldn't speak. He took my hand. His touch was both soft and strong. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to feel more of the experience, so I looked at him. His eyes met mine, and I could see fear, desire, guilt, and hope. Before I could speak, he took my hand. His touch was soft and intentional, and I could feel my breath quickening. I should have pulled away, but I didn't. Instead, I let him hold my hand. His grip was strong and gentle, as if he was afraid I would disappear. I don't want to hurt you, he said quietly, but I couldn't. His touch made my heart race. I wanted to pull away, but I couldn't. Instead, I let him take my hand. His grip was strong and gentle, like he was afraid I would disappear. I don't want to hurt you, he said quietly, but I couldn't stop myself. I didn't know what was happening, but his words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. My mind told me to stop, to back away, to say something to end this crazy feeling. But my body did something else. I leaned into his touch, wanting that connection that I hadn't felt in a long time. I didn't know what was going on, but I felt like I was in a moment where time stopped. I said, "Nathan," and my voice sounded a little shaky, but I was still calm enough to keep looking at him. He didn't say anything, but his eyes showed what he was thinking. He slowly moved his lips closer to mine, and I felt like he was waiting for me to tell him to stop. I didn't want to stop, because I felt like I was in a really intense moment. But my body was also telling me to stop. I felt like I was leaning into his touch, and I really wanted to feel that connection again. It felt like the space between us disappeared, and he was standing very close to me. I could feel his warm breath on my skin, and I could smell him, which was a really nice smell. My heart was beating really fast, but he stayed close to me, looking at me, and I felt like he was tilting his head a little while he was doing that. We were so close that time seemed to stop. I said, "Nathan," and my voice was shaking, but I was still calm enough to keep looking at him. He didn't say anything, but his eyes told me everything. He slowly and carefully put his lips close to mine, and he kissed me like he was waiting for me to tell him to stop. I closed my eyes, enjoying the warmth of his touch as he held my face. Our kiss got more intense, and I felt like something inside me broke open. I closed my eyes, feeling nervous and excited. I felt his warm hand on my face, and it made my heart beat faster. We kissed, and I felt something inside me that I hadn't felt in years. I felt lonely, so I held his shoulders and didn't want to let him go. We were the only two people there, and I could feel the energy between us. But then he stopped, breathing heavily, and looked at me. I felt a sense of isolation, and my hands found their way to his shoulders, holding on tightly. The world around us disappeared, leaving just the two of us and the obvious tension between us. But just as quickly as it started, it ended. Nathan took a step back, breathing heavily, and looked into my eyes, a mix of worry and desire. "We can't," he whispered, barely audible. "I don't want to hurt you or him," I said, my voice shaking. I admitted that my breathing was uneven, and I realized that my past words felt empty. The seriousness of what had just happened weighed heavily on me, and I understood that there was no going back. I sat on the side of my bed, thinking about what had happened. I felt worried and excited. I remembered Nathan's hand, his kiss, and how he looked at me with regret and desire in his eyes. I felt sad and confused. I touched my hair, which was still wet from the night before. "I don't want to hurt you or him," I said quietly. I know I said that before, but I didn't mean it. What happened last night was wrong, and now things will be different. I felt bad, and I was scared. I didn't know what to do. I sat there for a long time. I felt nervous and sad. I thought about what would happen next. I felt like I couldn't stop thinking about it. I felt like I was in a bad situation. I felt like I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The morning light came in through the curtains. It was soft and golden, but it didn't make me feel better. I was still worried. I sat on the side of my bed, and the silence of the house felt like a burden. I couldn't stop thinking about the previous night. I remembered the warmth of Nathan's hand, the taste of his kiss, and how he looked at me with regret and a dangerous desire in his eyes. I ran my fingers through my hair, which was still wet from the night before. I sat on the side of my bed. The silence of the house felt like a burden. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened the night before. I remembered Nathan's warm hand, his kiss, and how he looked at me with regret and a dangerous desire. I ran my fingers through my hair, still wet from a shower that didn't cleanse the guilt on my skin. I told myself that we hadn't done anything wrong and that we had stopped before anything bad happened, but I knew that boundaries are crossed not just through actions, but also through thoughts, emotions, and the fantasies we have when no one is watching. I felt restless and guilty. I told myself that we hadn't done anything too bad and that we had stopped before things got too bad. But I knew that boundaries are crossed not just through actions, but also through thoughts, emotions, and fantasies. Last night, every unspoken boundary had been crossed, and the sound of footsteps in the hallway made my heart race. I quickly stood up and smoothed the hem of my shirt, as if to hide the evidence of what had happened. The door opened, and I saw Nathan. His face looked neutral, but his eyes showed inner turmoil. Last night, I felt like I was crossing boundaries. I heard footsteps in the hallway and my heart started racing. I quickly stood up and fixed my shirt. The door opened, and I saw Nathan. He looked calm, but I could tell he was upset. I said a few words to him, and he looked at me. I looked away because I didn't want to deal with his emotions right then. We didn't say much after that. It felt like we were both nervous. Eventually, Nathan came into the room. He was quiet and tried to start a conversation. The door shut behind him as if he were unsure how to begin. "We must talk." I acknowledged that I spoke this hastily, my hands clutching the bed's edge. However, I am uncertain of what more remarks may be made. He asserted his tone resolutely but kindly as he stepped closer, ultimately positioning himself directly in front of me. "Last night," he stated that it cannot. He shut the door, and I realized I had to talk to him. I said, "I know I spoke too quickly. I'm sorry. I don't know what to say." He said, "I'm sorry, too. But I'm not going to let this happen again." I moved my hand to my chest to show I understood, but I was still upset. He looked at me, and his face softened. He said, "I know this is hard for you, I'm sorry." I looked up at him, and my heart was beating really fast. I said, "Nathan, we can't do this. It's too complicated. It's too important." "Emotions are complicated," he said, his voice low and quiet. He reached out his hand and touched mine for a second, maybe by accident, but maybe not. "I can't ignore this." His words hit me like a knife. He was right, it was really scary, but being real didn't mean. He said emotions are complicated. His voice was low and quiet, like a quiet voice. He put his hand on mine, but it was too fast for me to notice if he meant to do it or not. I closed my eyes. His words hurt me like a knife. He was right. It was really scary, but being real does not mean being good or safe. I took my hand away from his. "We can't do this anymore," I said, my voice shaking. "If Greg finds out about this, he will be very angry." Nathan said, his voice was sharp and clear. "Hek, you are too busy with work to understand what is happening here. This does not make it okay," I said, feeling angry. "You are his son and stepson." I pulled my hand back, creating some distance between us. "We can't continue this." My voice was shaking. "If Greg finds out, he'll be furious." Nathan spoke abruptly, his tone sharp. "Greg's too busy with work to notice what's happening here. That doesn't make it okay." I felt frustrated. "You're his son, stepson. I'm an adult, and so is he." His comments hung in the air, making the room feel tense. I looked away, my hands shaking as I held the chair at the window. The sunlight felt harsh and too bright, showing too much. "This issue is bigger than us," I eventually said, my voice almost quiet. "It includes." He made his voice sound different, and I was an adult, so were you. His comments continued, and the room felt a little uncomfortable. I looked away, and my hands were shaking as I held the back of the chair at the window. The sunshine felt too bright, too much, and it showed everything. "This is about more than us," I eventually said, my voice almost quiet. "It's about all other things, Greg, this house, our life, and what we want." He said, his tone became softer, "And maybe it was about what we deserve." I turned to look at him, and my heart felt heavy with his words. His eyes looked at mine, and I could see the same problems that had been bothering me: guilt, desire, and fear. He came closer, and I stayed still. See, Greg, our lives, our home, they all come down to what we want, he said, his voice softer. What do we deserve? I turned to look at him. My heart felt heavy with his words. His eyes looked at me, showing the same confusion and fear that had been bothering me. He came closer, and I stayed still. He said my name quietly, and I shivered. I tried to speak, but I could only be quiet. I couldn't tell him how I felt. I couldn't lie to him or to myself. His hand touched my face again, gently, and it made my heart race. His thumb moved over my skin. He said my name in a whisper that made me shiver. I tried to say what I was thinking, but I couldn't. I was silent because I couldn't explain how I felt. He put his hand on my face again, this time gently, and it made me want to lean into his touch. I longed for the connection that I had hidden for a long time. I said something, my voice shaking, and he looked at me. In that moment, everything disappeared. There was no Greg, no home, and no consequences. We were on the edge of something dangerous and unavoidable. I said, I can't do this, but my voice was shaking. I felt my body leaning towards him, longing for the connection I had denied for so long. I heard myself muttering, my voice quivering. His gaze locked onto mine, and in that moment, everything around me disappeared. There was just Greg, our home, and the unknown. I felt like we were teetering on the edge of something dangerous, and I couldn't do this. Yes, you can, he said, his voice firm. We can both. Before I could respond, the sudden sound of a car door slamming outside interrupted us. My heart pounded as I stepped back from him, overwhelmed by panic. It's Greg, I said, my voice filled with urgency. Nathan stepped back, his presence showing a mix of he lacked confidence. Yes, you can, he said, his voice subdued. We both can. Before I could reply, the sudden sound of a car door slamming outside interrupted us, causing my heart to race. I felt panic surge through my veins. It's Greg, I said, my voice urgent. Nathan left, looking exasperated and resigned. He said we will talk later, his tone resolute. I nodded, my thoughts racing as I approached the door. My hand clutched the doorknob as if it were my only anchor. I heard the front door open, followed by Greg's voice announcing his arrival. Hey, honey, he shouted, his tone cheerful and oblivious. I forced a smile as I stepped into the he said we would talk later, and I nodded. I was thinking quickly as I went to the door. I grabbed the doorknob as if it were my only support. I heard the front door open, and then Greg said he had arrived. Hey, honey, he said, sounding happy and unaware. I smiled as I walked into the hallway, away from the chaos. But I was still thinking about what was going on behind me. As I greeted him, I thought about the decisions that still needed to be made. The calm moments of the day ahead would only last a little while before the chaos started again. Deep down, I knew that this was only the start of a story that was not over yet.